Welcome to the Medical Minimus Podcast, your source for memory techniques and accelerated learning in higher education. Now, here's your host, Chase DeMarco.
Welcome back to the final leg of our mini-series, and this recap series, this short audio course, if you will, has covered some of the science-based study practices students should implement now, and it has also covered unique note-taking practices and memory techniques to improve long-term retention. In today's episode, we're going to cover how to control our state of mind during testing and other stressful situations, as well as what a difference our mindset can make in our studies. In the last recap episode, we'll finish off with how we actually tackle a test after implementing these cognitive and physiologic tools, and how to remain motivated during difficult times and prolonged study sessions. Altogether, this 7-part recap is really a masterclass of studying and test taking. So take these bits of expert advice and use them immediately. We're here to help you succeed, and by being active with these processes and strategies, we can almost guarantee better performance in the long run. As always, if you want to know more about these interviews, hear the full interviews, and see if there's any associated discounts with that particular interview, you can see the individual episodes at freemeded.org/podcasts. And you're going to hear a lot of slashes today, as we mentioned a lot of different pages for you to go visit to check out. One of them is /OMES. So when you go to freemeded.org/OMES, you will find information and growing information on our online medical education summit, this free virtual conference that you really should attend if you want to find out more about the next generation of online medical education content. We also have our medical mnemonist meetups that are going to happen more regularly. That'll be at freemeded.org/meetup. So we have /podcast, we have /OMES, we have /meetup. We also have /medstudent for those that would like to download our free workbook or purchase our book, Read This Before Medical School. And of course, if you have already purchased this, please do leave a review by going to /bookreviews. We really appreciate it. Alright, so many of us know that our mind state can actually shape how we approach a problem, including our academic exams. But often when we hear discussions about changing our minds through some type of practice or meditation or something like that, we might fall into the trap that maybe this is too woo-woo for us or something that's out of our control. According to Howard Berg, he has trained students, lifeguards, even Green Berets using these conditioned responses to calm down during stressful events. So let's see what he has to say on the subject.
It's easy to get nervous and not remember anything. You already know what to do, but if you're in the wrong state, you won't remember anything. The state you're in when you learn is the state you need to be in when you will use knowledge. What I'd like you to do, and it takes 90 days to form a habit, not 30 like they used to teach. Play some very relaxing music like Brahms' Lullaby. It puts babies to sleep. After you hear it, gently squeeze your left thumb and say, I feel relaxed, because you do. Do that every day for 90 days. Now you're in an important exam, or you're in the hospital and something horrible happens and you really have to stay focused. You gently squeeze your left thumb and say, I feel relaxed. And what would happen? That's your stimulus response. You've created a state and a stimulus.
So consider how you can use something like this in your daily studies. We often study for board exams for multiple weeks, multiple months, definitely up to those 90 days that he mentioned, and adding in one of these conditioned responses before each practice session for this long amount of time, for this extended time frame that we're studying, could then become useful before the actual board exam or before an interview. So adding this in as part of our training, as part of our normal repetition, is something that can become very useful later on. And this is also amplified by Dr. Anders Ericsson, author of Peak, The Science of Expertise.
But in general, I would argue that designing your training, or at least part of the training, should be focused on those performance constraints. So I know, for example, that advanced music students, when they actually practice something in the practice room, there are different rules. If they make a mistake, they can just stop and then do it over. But when you're actually in front of an audience, maybe even with an orchestra, if you make a mistake, it's not like you can kind of stop and just do it over. And if you did, people would be annoyed because it would, really detract from their experience of the music itself.
We've all heard that we need to practice the same way that we're going to play. We need to study in the same way that we're going to test. Very few instructors will focus on these state-dependent and conditioned responses, but if you're concerned about your testing and your test anxiety, there's nothing better that you can do for yourself than add these types of conditioned responses to your normal study habits. So maybe we can precondition even more than this, more than just before we sit down and start taking a test or before a stressful event happens. But what about if something happens during a test or an interview? What if you know that you make a mistake and those cortisol and stress hormones start to rise? What can you do under this situation?
Step one is aspire, set your goals and analyze, figure out what it is you're doing, what you need to do to achieve. Step two, act, do it. Step three, assess. Step four, adapt. That's the metacognition cycle. And you just nailed it. So get your mind right at the beginning, have your plan of attack, always be willing to adjust it. And your plan of attack now is all these techniques you've been giving your listeners, all these concepts of recall. How do we link? How do we conceptualize? And then the assess and adapt. That's when we come back and say, okay, I've noticed myself blanking out at these moments, or I've noticed myself turning off in these stages. What can I do to address that? And we just keep going forward. That, ladies and gentlemen, is learning in a nutshell.
So with Jared Cooney Horvath's advice here, it sounds like we can make this adaptive too. We can adapt our state-dependent actions and memories and feelings based on training during our study sessions. But how do we know when we're going off the rails? What can trigger us to become aware of these changes and then pick the correct path to regain our control and re-enter that state that we've already created?
The brain kind of has two modes of learning. One you can kind of call, well, just for simplification's sake, we'll call autopilot. You have a story, you know how the world should be. The world comes in, you just run your autopilot. This is like when you drive to school and you pull into the parking lot and 20 minutes later, you're like, whoa, what happened in the last 20 minutes? You're just running a program. The other mode is what we'll call coder mode. So this is when you actively have to kick into the present moment. Your attention becomes focused, and in this moment, you can change your autopilot story. So one of the best and easiest ways to get into your coder mode is to screw up. If you have a prediction, a way of thinking about the world, an autopilot program that fails, you don't have a choice. Your coder automatically kicks on. It's a safety mechanism. So if you've ever been walking down the stairs and you miscounted and there was one extra step and you go stumbling forward, in that moment, that jolt you got, that's your coder kicking in saying, uh-oh, our prediction's wrong. We need to change our story because it could be dangerous. We might die. The brain doesn't know. So when you make an error, when a prediction fails, in that moment, your entire system becomes primed to learn. You will never learn faster, easier, or better than you will in that moment. Unfortunately, in that moment, you then enter into a choice. You can engage with the coder, in which case you start to update. And this is what we call theta mode. The brain flips to theta. That is the signature that essentially plasticity is happening, that the brain is rewiring itself, that you're now updating your understanding. But that's a choice. You need to choose to engage with that error. So you don't get to choose when your coder comes on. You make an error, your coder comes on whether you want to or not. But in that moment, you then get to choose. Do I go with it and update, or do I avoid it because it feels easier and just forget that it happened? A lot of people try and skip that analysis step, and that's one of the most important ones, believe it or not. Machine learning happens by aspiring, assessing, adapting. Cool. A plant learns by aspiring, assessing, adapting. A dog learns by aspiring, assessing, adapting. What humans can do that, so far as we can tell, no other animal can do, or at least not anywhere near as powerful as us, is analyze.
So consider the scenario where you're taking a practice exam at home, or maybe you're in the exam room taking a real exam, and you just know that you got an answer wrong. This can be very frustrating, and your stress level can rise, and this can negatively impact the rest of your performance throughout that test. So by being able to analyze the scenario, as we can do as humans that learn, and being able to utilize these preconditioned responses, we can then get back into a focused state and make sure that we stay on track, on mission for the rest of this test. Jared also goes in to explain that learning kind of doesn't feel good, especially when you get something wrong. Your body, your brain just send out negative responses, and a lot of learners will innately, as we evolve to do, try to avoid these negative responses, try to make sure they don't happen. But as you'll hear next with Dr. Daniel Sadoway-Konofka, these negative feelings are the most opportune times to learn.
When you do this part well, this is the mental contrasting part. It's the best outcome contrasted with the critical inner obstacle. It actually feels pretty lousy. It's not going to make you feel really well because basically what you're doing is identifying the very obstacle that's completely under your control, that's stopping you from achieving the wish that you'd like to achieve and the outcomes that you could be otherwise getting. So the next step is the plan. And this is a very particular type of plan. It's called an implementation intention. So it's basically the intention of how you're going to implement it. And it takes the form as follows. It's if obstacle, then I will plan. So some action, some thought, something that I can do to overcome that obstacle. And this is important, in the moment.
All right, so let's try to put some of these main points together. We have initially our preconditioned responses that we can work on, that we can develop through habits, through our study sessions at home, for weeks to months before a stressful event that we're projecting. A board exam is a great example of when this could be useful. For the weeks coming up to the exam, we pre-program ourselves with some response that'll help us relax during the exam. We also become aware of when we're becoming stressed, when we're triggered, and then we can utilize that awareness of it to use our conditioned response. And then as Dr. Sadoway-Konofka mentioned here, we can also plan a way around it. So we can plan to use this conditioned response when we're stressed, or that one, or a different one if we're becoming tired or our mind is getting foggy. By utilizing these different tools and awareness and techniques, we can prep our minds for the event and the physiologic responses that we'll receive when we know something's maybe not quite right, or we know for a fact we just got that last question wrong. So up to this point, we've really focused on preparing for our physiologic responses and having a plan in place and a method in place to counteract those physiologic responses to stress and to a testing environment. But what can we do cognitively? What can we do to shift our mindset before and during these stressful times to benefit our overall test scores? One way to best prepare and shift your mindset in a positive way for an upcoming exam is to be familiar with the questions that are going to be on the test. Not just the material, the content, but the style of the question and who's writing it, as we hear here with Dr. Barbara Oakley.
Professors do not like you to look at old tests because it makes their job harder. They have to make up more questions. But a lot of times what professors are doing is they're just grabbing from, let's say that when they were grad students 40 years before, they had a test. And they'll grab a question from that has a really different set of nomenclatures and assumptions and so forth, and they'll put it on the test. And it's very difficult for you to do well on that kind of question, unless you've seen it before. The only way to see it before is to see the old tests. So I do highly recommend things like Course Hero and so forth, to look at old tests and look at materials, because the more practice you get with the material you're actually going to see from that professor, the better you're going to be able to match wits with them on testing.
So now we have the proper materials. We know what to expect. We know the style and the format of our future assessment type. But what can we do mentally? What about our own negative connotations about the exam, or maybe our own skills? How can those impact our testing abilities? Here we're joined again by Abby Marks Beal.
I think there's this attitude everybody comes to the table with when they start doing learning. And if it's more like, I don't know how I'm going to learn all this, or I won't remember that, or this is really hard, then it's going to be really hard, and it's going to be really hard to remember it. But if you can catch yourself just saying these words and saying, wait a minute, no, I can do this. It is possible, one step at a time, just really be your own cheerleader. I think you're going to find it helpful. The thing is, we don't see it for ourselves. So tell the people around you, your fellow students, hey, catch me if I'm being negative, will you?
Similar to when we discussed becoming aware of our mistakes and how that affects our physiologic responses, we can become aware of our negative cognitive changes as well, and these negative mindsets, and stop the negative talk before it becomes a serious problem. After we have prepared and controlled for our physiologic responses and our mental or cognitive responses to these stressful events, there are some other tools that we should probably look towards to improve our abilities. One of the best things we can do in this situation is to find a mentor. This coaching or mentorship that we attain through experts can not only help us with our own knowledge of the content, but also in how to think of the entire organization, the entire process of learning this material. Or, as we will hear here with Jake Gittleson from the Learning Geeks podcast, the mental representations that an expert would have and can convey on us.
So a medical teacher has a very mature mental representation of a specific topic or various things, right? And they're probably super complex, but they can help you, especially be best buds outside of their normal context. They can help you build your own mental representations that are accurate. And I think in one of their chapters, they said, get a teacher, which of course, going to Star Wars makes me always think of Kylo Ren in The Force Awakens yelling at Rey, like, get a teacher. But what they mean by this is that if you stay within a bubble of people that you have a particular view or complete a task or a particular way that is not accurate, your mental representation of that will be inaccurate. So a teacher, one is an expert on something, learn from them.
Here, Jake discusses mental representations as we have learned about them from Peak, the Science of Expertise from Dr. Anders Ericsson. But who better to hear this information from in detail than the man himself? And a clarification of the 10,000 hour rule and how we can utilize this to become experts in our own fields.
The very best group, actually, as an average, had spent 10,000 hours in this type of solitary training, which was reliably more than the other two groups. But when Gladwell was reading this, I guess he was drawing more the inference here. They've spent a lot of time working on things related to their domain, and that there was something magical here about 10,000 hours. And I guess that's what we're disagreeing with. We're agreeing with Gladwell's claim that international level performance doesn't just pop up without any preparation. But this idea here that there's something magical about 10,000 hours, I think is really shown to be incorrect. That you can't count hours, and I guess Gladwell mentioned the Beatles and the fact that they've been playing music in these various places in Hamburg for, pretty much 12 hours a day. That's not the same thing as taking time off, working on trying to improve specific things so you can improve. So just putting in the hours is really very, very different. And we see that in all the professional domains, that if people are just keep on working, that seems to be essentially unrelated after the first couple of years, at least, with your performance. So if you want to actually improve, you're going to have to do something different.
The key takeaway here is that it's not the amount of time dedicated to a skill or acquisition of knowledge, but the quality of the time, the effort that's put into the time, that's going to make the big difference. This is where we'll need to add something new, and this is where deliberate practice comes into play. And mentorship is a part of this. This mentorship, this guidance, can not only prove beneficial in getting you to the next level, but pointing out the steps in the process that you might be missing. And it's also important to note that, according to his research, anyone can develop this expertise or this advancement in their own skill. There are no natural traits that make one person better than the other. It's the approach, it's the process, and it's the guidance when we get stuck in the process that makes the difference.
I've yet to find somebody who is really exceptional, where once you start analyze what they're doing, you can't sort of look in under the hood and see here the things that are actually going on. And that makes it obviously a little easier for people who can't do these things to at least see what the difference is. Then the question is, do you have the time and the motivation here to acquire those skills so you actually would be able to acquire those mechanisms or not? So I guess for medicine, I would argue that when you're taking a course, it's not preparing for the test the target is actually having organized your knowledge in a way that may actually be a little bit different from the way it's taught, and in particular, the way it's tested.
Okay, so I've discussed deliberate practice several times in past episodes, and there is another similar term called purposeful practice. But what do these terms mean, and how do they differ? Here I discuss it with Dr. Anders Ericsson.
Purposeful practice is basically using the same 4-step process, but when you don't have an instructor, when you're doing it yourself, you're just putting in the extra purpose, the extra effort. Whereas deliberate practice is when you have some sort of mentor or expert, someone with higher knowledge than you, that can then point out your mistakes and sort of guide you on how to correct them on your next go around. Is that about right?
I think you captured that completely correctly. One of the problems, I guess, and why we think the distinction is so important is that there are domains where people do a lot of crazy things that they think is actually going to improve their performance, but there's really no evidence. I guess what we find is that ideally you should identify now what it is that is part of the performance that you want to attain, that you will now focus in on improving. So this idea of just trying to do everything better doesn't seem to be associated with effective improvement. So instead, you identify something that is sort of more specific. And then in a sense here, you would be able to identify now what you would like it to be and where you're currently at. And then the key thing is finding now a training activity that would allow you to get closer to that goal by repetition and by acquiring now sort of new methods for basically producing the performance for that particular aspect. A lot of music students, when they're actually practicing, they're just playing through the piece again and again, and they don't get any better. They may, repeat the same mistakes and everything. So obviously, you need to be focused now on what it is that you need to change. And if there's a section that is particularly hard, I think more advanced students, they wouldn't play through the whole piece. They would basically now work on that section that they have difficulty with.
And that's probably the most important first step in deliberate practice is finding your goal. What are you trying to improve? It's not supposed to be for everything, but a particular subject, a particular skill, a particular topic. Focusing on that goal and finding how you can improve specifically that goal is a great step in improvement overall. But again, when all else fails, have a mentor, have a tutor, have a coach, someone that you can turn to with more skills and knowledge and stronger mental representations than yourself to guide you on the next step of advancement.
I think it was Atul Gawande, who's a famous author on various medical issues, were recommended that. And I think in general, other surgeons that I talked to, they would videotape the surgery. And I think especially, if you do minimally invasive surgeries, then, it's very easy here to kind of record the entire surgery. And then you could now go back when you have knowledge here, maybe even of the outcome of any kind of complication that happened later on, you will be able to sort of go back in much the same way that soccer players and basketball players review the game once it's done to be able to address something that they could have or should have done different. And then if it's a matter of skill, then it's not just a matter of saying, okay, you should do this better. Now you have to actually acquire those skills that will allow you now to have a better outcome in a systematic way.
And now we're at the best part of these episodes, I think anyway, and that is the key points, the key takeaways that are going to put you to the next level of your studies. But of course, I do want to first mention a few things. Since we've been discussing tutoring so much in this episode and mentorship and how that can set you to the next stage, and if you would like some tutoring from me, whether this be about study techniques and test-taking skills or mnemonics creation and accelerated learning, you can of course go to freemeded.org/tutoring. If a community setting is more your style, then we are going to start doing these medical mnemonist meetups more regularly. For the next date, And for all future days, you can keep checking back on the same page, and that's going to be freemeded.org/meetup. Through the /tutoring and the /meetup pages, you can keep updated on all of your tutoring, peer recommendations, other ways to connect and communicate with us, and advance through this collaboration. If text is more your style, of course, you can also use our book, which has a lot of these tips and others and charts and a lot of information for you to utilize at a very affordable price at /medstudent on our website. And lastly, we're going to do one more /, and that's /OMES for our online medical education summit. The temporary page is up right now, and it'll be updated as more vendors and associated student organizations finalize their participation. But this is going to be our really interesting online free conference for you students. We'll have great lectures, hopefully some great discounts, and a lot of information where you can just come and chat with us, with other vendors from Kaplan to Picmonic, and a lot of other useful vendors and information out there for your personal studies. And for the key takeaways today, we have again focused on a lot of things that aren't just test-taking content. Too many people, I feel, focus on the content and less on the actual test-taking abilities and the skills development for test-taking. And the first one is that physiologic conditioning, that state-dependent memory and conditioning that we can do during every session to prepare for this stressful testing environment. And following along with the same pattern is the mental conditioning, or having that mindset, awareness of our current mindset, getting rid of the negative self-talk, and having these plans for if a physiologic response or a mental response starts to impede on our test-taking abilities. What can we do? How can we prepare for those? And then the last one, of course, is deliberate practice and mentorship. Through these practices, we can become experts in our own fields and on the subject matter as well. It takes a plan, it takes goals, and it takes effort. And then it might take a little bit of extra guidance from someone with stronger mental representations than ourselves. So I hope these have been very insightful and useful for you. As always, please reach out to us on social media or through email. Check the show notes as well. All of the past interviews mentioned in this episode will be available there, and I will catch you next week. One last thing, after recording this episode, we did pick a date for the next Medical Nemesis meetup, and that's going to be Friday, April 10th. So go to freemeded.org/meetup and register for your free ticket. Be held again on Friday, April 10th. Get your free ticket now. I will see you at the meetup.